So just mute one speaker. There we go. Elisio Macamo is a sociology and African studies professor at the University of Basel in Switzerland. He's Mozambican. He studied in Mozambique, England, and Germany. His main research interests are risk and technology, knowledge, religion, labor, politics, development, and methods. His geographical focus is Africa, particularly Portuguese-speaking countries in Southern Africa. But he has research projects in Mali, Burkina Faso, Zambia, and South Africa, and Brazil. In the last 4 years, he has been working on the challenges of academic training in Africa in collaboration with Professor Mamadou Diawara in the context of a project funded by Gerda Henkel, Pilot Postgraduate Academy of African Studies in Bamako, and also on the translation of concepts that have been applied or emerged in Africa to research in Europe, in the context of a Synergia project funded by the Swiss National Fund called Reversing the Gaze. Among his most recent publications are 2022 Social Analysis for Lay People in Portuguese. Thank you so much for being with us here, Professor Macamo. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chanel, and thank you to the whole group and those who are here to listen to me. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to join you thinking on ways of grappling with knowledge which seek to be different from those enabling us to take such a journey. When I give a talk away from home, I like to learn something about the place where the talk is taking place. I know, of course, that I'm not away from home. I'm sitting firmly in my office. But it is as if we're in Pennsylvania because your university is the venue for this talk. And of course, the two things you cannot avoid learning about your region are the Quakers and slavery. So I read a fascinating book by way of preparing myself for this by Katharina Gerbner. The book is called Christian Slavery, Conversion and Race in the Protestant Atlantic World, most of which is, of course, set in Barbados, but with strong connections to Pennsylvania and the role later played by Quakers in the slavery abolition movement in the US. Now, Gebner debunks the idea that Quakers acted against slavery out of their deep religious beliefs. She shows in her book that Quakers in 17th century Barbados originally thought that slavery was consistent with Christianity. So they sought to convert enslaved people, or to convince them in proper Quaker language, so that they would be more docile. And they did this against the opposition of Protestants who feared that an enslaved Christian would undermine the odious practice of slavery, since enslaving fellow Christians would be theologically untenable. Now, I start with these thoughts to make the central claim of my presentation, namely that the meaning of things is not to be found necessarily in the words we use to describe or to label them. The meaning of things, in my view, is to be found in the unveiling, the uncovering of the circumstances under which things come to count as something specific. As scholars, we are in the business of reflecting on how we experience the world through the claims we make to understand the representations of others. So I submit to you that key to the African experience of the world is a particular relationship to the vocabulary of the social sciences, which from its inception has been centered on representing the colonial world as something inevitable. So I understand translation as the process by which we use concepts to bring the world closer to us, or for that matter, to distance the world from us. Now, this is a particularly challenging task since, as I will argue, The place of enunciation has always posed a significant challenge for scholars defined by their non-Western origin. The conceptual vocabulary we deploy to critique representations made of us is not different from the vocabulary deployed by those who we think misrepresent us. It is hard not to feel suspicious of our own endeavor, for our ability to articulate this criticism in ways that are even convincing to those we critique posits the very discomforting possibility that these conceptual vocabularies may be using us to say what they want us to say and not what we really want to say. So sometimes I lose sleep at night when I think of this, especially when I remember an occasion when a non-African colleague agreed with me. So to what extent can we really rely on this conceptual vocabulary to render our discomfort legitimate and intelligible? How critical can we be when the language with which critique is voiced is the language of the oppressor? So I want to discuss the meaning of these questions to the very possibility of Southern epistemologies. And I want to suggest that salvation may rest with how we consciously engage in the work of translation to produce new ideas, to organize the facts which help us make sense of the world. And those new ideas would be what I would describe as theory. Now, I think all of us here are part of an intellectual tradition which has made a virtue out of challenging how we take the world for granted. The claim that this intellectual tradition makes is that the social sciences are complicit in the celebration of the cruel way in which other possible worlds were made, well, unfeasible or unviable. In this sense, then, to deploy the language of the social sciences carries with it the risk and the price of dwelling within a colonial discourse that may naturalize historical processes which are perhaps best left alone. Now, the intellectual tradition I'm speaking about has not only made a virtue out of challenging these underlying assumptions, it has also, of course, opened up professional opportunities for some of us to tender our anger and rage over how history treated us in exchange, well, for academic positions and for speaking to a distinguished audience at Penn State University. And, you know, even if it is only done virtually. Now, the problem is that nothing is innocent against the background of the history that brought the world together as a discursive entity. The realization that the world is discursively constructed can be understood as the loss of innocence, but not the innocence of the people who were conquered or taken away from their histories, but rather the loss of innocence of all accounts of the human condition, which draw from a conceptual vocabulary developed at a particular place. And here I mean Europe, and at a particular time. And here I mean, you know, around the 18th and 19th century, under very particular circumstances, which were the European expansion, and hence the global imperial design of which Sabelo Ndovugachene speaks, and colonialism, and of course also within a particular intellectual framework, that is the Enlightenment project. Now, what we know, and consequently, what we choose not to know, is not a function of us being humans and therefore being subject to error. What we know, and consequently, what we choose not to know, is a function of the language we deploy to make sense of the world. And as I make this claim, I'm appealing to Ludwig Wittgenstein, who once said that the limits of our language are the limits of our world. And I think he was right in making that claim. Now, with this, I'm not suggesting a crude form of nominalism or constructionism, whereby reality is an artifact simply of language. I think the world will exist beyond our language as brute facts, to use the American philosopher's words, John Searle. However, as he also argues, and I adopt that argument, we are in the business of producing social facts, which boils down to what counts as something particular under certain circumstances. I guess I'm trying to engage you in a conversation about how the world as we know it has resulted from our ability to name things. And there's no original thought in that. For Nietzsche, of whom I'm a proud posthumous colleague at the University of Basel, he taught here. Of course, I know less brilliant than he was, but probably just as nuts as he was, said something to this effect first. The moment we can name something, we render it visible, but we also render it intelligible. So how we relate with the world may help us understand how the world grew as one. That is, for example, how it globalized. Well, it would be fair to say that the world globalized through the economic migration of Europeans. I think it is equally sensible to argue that the world globalized through Europeans' ability and power to name things. In other words, there was no Africa before Europeans used that word to describe the continent we know today as Africa. Naming is, of course, much more than just saying, well, from now on, this sandwich made of thinly sliced beef cooked on a griddle and served on a sliced roll with cheese and either with or without onions will be called cheese steak. Naming is the process of making cheese steak a significant part of one's life and culture in Pennsylvania, but also a way of establishing what is familiar and what is unfamiliar. So when you have a name for that sandwich, you have acquired an additional way of defining yourself against others. And perhaps you've also acquired an important reason to die for what you think that you stand for. Now, as far as Africa is concerned, I hope you understand what I mean here. The continent, of course, existed, and the word Africa as well. And that is not the point I'm making. I'm saying something scholars before me have already drawn our attention to. And that is the idea that there is a dialectic underlying the invention of the globalized world we live in. It is a world built on differences and similarities. The concept of the universal, for example, is central to the tension between difference and similarity, which in some ways implies the contradictory assumption that one part of the world represents the ideal of humanity much better, in fact, much more accurately than whatever can be found elsewhere. But not only this, the concept of the universal provides the framework within which naming things produces those things as particular things. This is the sense in which, for example, the Congolese scholar Valentin Mudimbe spoke about the invention of Africa in his book with that same title. Just like Edward Said in his work on Orientalism, or for that matter, and I'm glad to learn that Walter Mignolo also participated here in his work on the idea of Latin America. Now, Mudimbe made the point that what we know today to be Africa is consistent with a European representation of a part of the world which had the goal to domesticate that part of the world to whatever interest Europeans pursued when they named it. Now, more than establishing that Africa is an artifact of a European will to power, I think it would be interesting to see how this was done. In the particular case of Africa, the key moment is represented by the idea of social change. So social change operated, as it were, as an algorithm which explained modernity. And modernity, as conceptualized by the Enlightenment project, became a tool with which Europeans were going to take control of the world by laying down a set of precise rules to be followed in search of something that came to be known as progress. Now, it is difficult to fully appreciate the claims of modernity, and in particular, what a colleague in sociology has described as modernity's biggest achievement, namely its ability to turn the future into a social project without proper consideration of the fundamental change that the algorithm represented. And that change consisted basically of the idea that truth was a function of procedure. So modernity's imposition of progress as the natural outcome of any attempt at mastering the future also relied on a total neglect of the assumptions which were built into it. So social change posits social cohesion as a function of what needs to be done to allow history to take its course. And since history was supposed to be moving further beyond, or plus ultra, towards progress, the vocabulary of the social sciences made social organization an artifact of change and not a local response to local circumstances. So to be modern was to respond to organic forms of social integration, to use Durkheim's terminology, or to undergo Vergesellschaftung, to use Weber's terminology, or to be more nostalgic perhaps, to be society instead of community. Now, not to be modern was not simply not being organically integrated, that is mechanically integrated, but rather being in a state of transition to those forms that were thought to be compatible with the right way of being in the world. So theories of social change became, if you like, social science truth machines, whose job it was to sustain the illusion of a dynamic Western culture, which was in motion towards progress, against stagnant non-European societies held back by their inability to embrace progress and to join, if you like, the human race. Now, what is it that we are talking about when we talk about the world, for example? What is our knowledge, as it were, knowledge of? Is there something out there that we seek to grasp? Or is it rather that our conceptual tools fool us into thinking that there's something when there is nothing? The idea of the world underlying our understanding of the world is constitutive of how Europe understands itself, and by extension, what its conceptual vocabulary can imagine. So when I describe translation as the process by which we manipulate the distance between us and the world, what I'm trying to convey is the importance of thinking of conceptual categories, such as those we encounter in our social scientific work. I don't know, categories like space, place, time, landscape, and location, and so on, as articulations not only of different experiences of the world, but also articulations of diverse modes of rendering the world visible and intelligible, as well as articulations of the possibility that their meaning may be constrained by the discourses which frame them. So translating as theory from the inside means that we are cognizant of our position as deeply implicated in the conceptual vocabularies we have made our own. So I insist on the idea of manipulation to remind myself, and perhaps also to remind you, that the idea of a world that can be written, that is, a world that can be turned into an object of study about which it is worthwhile producing descriptions, has not yet yielded all the insights it holds in store for us. The challenge is not to establish that everything has been said. Instead, it is to insist that not everyone has said everything that has been said, because the more people state what appears obvious, the more uncomfortable we will be in repeating trivia. And that will motivate us to think harder. And who knows, that will motivate us to discover new truths, or at any rate, chance upon what some may have been reluctant to know. Now, I see no reason for us to confidently move on to discuss the consequences of a colonial world, as post-colonialism would wish us to do, or even to discard the terms through which we perceive the world as a viable intellectual project, as decolonial approaches may increasingly seem to be demanding from us. I think conceptual vocabularies do not change their character by intellectual proclamation. We can celebrate our ability to be critical of the underlying ethnocentrism besetting our scholarly endeavors, and that would be fine. However, the fact of the matter is that whether we like it or not, we are still committed to an idea of the world and how it can be rendered intelligible, which holds us hostage to those conceptual vocabularies. And I guess the question I'm trying to formulate here is whether we can speak from nowhere. And as far as I'm concerned, and as a student of Africa, whether I can be critical of the vocabulary of the social sciences while at the same time using its language. But then again, how can I speak otherwise without risking not being understood? Now, let me try to illustrate this with thoughts on an excerpt from an important document which was written and published in 1919. At a summer school which was held here in Basel, a friend and colleague of mine, Philip Lepenis, drew my attention to Article 22 of the Covenant of the League of Nations, which, as you might know, was brought into life at the end of a major multinational armed conflict in Europe, known arrogantly as the First World War. The article dealt with the fate of colonies belonging to the defeated nations, that is, to Germany and to the Ottoman Empire. Let me read the first two provisions of that article because I think they are quite interesting and illustrative of the point I want to make here. So the first provision reads as follows. To those colonies and territories which, as a consequence of the late war, have ceased to be under the sovereignty of the states which formerly governed them and which are inhabited by peoples not yet able to stand by themselves under the strenuous conditions of the modern world, there should be applied the principle that the well-being and development of such peoples form a sacred trust of civilization, and that securities for the performance of this trust should be embodied in this covenant. Notice here both the euphemism under the sovereignty of the states which formerly governed them, as well as the heartwarming concern of oppressors when they worry about those who are not yet able to stand by themselves under what they describe as the strenuous conditions of the modern world. The second provision reads as follows, and let me quote it to you as well. The best method of giving practical effect to this principle is that the tutelage of such peoples should be entrusted to advanced nations who, by reason of their resources, their experience, or their geographical position, can best undertake this responsibility and who are willing to accept it, and that this tutelage should be exercised by them as mandatories on behalf of the League. And here also, I couldn't help noticing the use of the word tutelage, which is what you do with infants, with children, and the appeal to the notion of advanced nations, thereby suggesting an evolutionary scale by which to apportion, to distribute responsibility. It would, of course, be rather anachronistic to place too much weight on the words that were used, for they spoke to their immediate historical context, and they were rendered intelligible by the moral lingua franca of the day, which basically consisted in the idea of a single world held together by an assumed commitment of all, including of those who were not asked for their opinion on the matter, that is, peoples not yet able to stand by themselves under the strenuous conditions of the modern world, to working together towards improving the human condition. So when I claim that concepts manipulate our relationship with and to the world, I mean basically three things that bring to the fore the idea of translation as theory from within, an idea for which I'm pitching here. One thing is the notion of a gaze. This notion is not shorthand for perspective or approach. Rather, it is a phenomenological commitment to the importance of lived experience as an eye-opener. In other words, I engage the notion of gaze to argue that the ability to write the world, that is, to speak about it, rests on history. It is a meaningful historical account. Whenever we see something, we are producing a historical account. So the world described by maps does not exist independently of the history that made that description possible. Rather, the world that is described by maps is produced by history. And that is another way of claiming that in very important respects, what we take to be the object of the conceptual vocabulary of the social sciences is in fact a description always of a potential world. Now, the second key issue in this intellectual agenda is the idea of ordering. It is my way of recovering a sense of the disciplinary power of knowledge, to the extent that what we can claim to know or to be able to know lives off some notion of the good life. I've always found it noteworthy that Europe's relationship with Africa has always been described with reference to words that suggest a better life, so progress, civilization, and development. And my hunch is that this is accounted for by the disciplinary power of knowledge, with its ability to turn individuals into artifacts of power. So the third and final key issue I'm addressing is the idea of full circles, by which I mean the paradox of critique, which is attendant upon any self-conscious scholarly attitude towards one's own intellectual tradition. This will be, if you like, the opportunity, or it is the opportunity for me to explain why I do not think that the time has yet come to speak of a post-colonial or even of a decolonial, I don't know, geography, for example. In the momentous provisions of Article 22 of the League of Nations, we get the sense that the founding of the League of Nations could also have been described as an attempt at both taking stock of changes and new beginnings, as well as looking into the future of the world in its European clothing. So the founding of the League of Nations gave further substance to the idea of the world both as a physical entity and as a community of fate, pretty much along the lines plotted by the idea of gazes as I'm trying to deploy it here. Now, you remember that I defined the notion of gazes as describing a potential world. So the idea of a League of Nations, it represented a European will to power that not only confirmed the existence of the world as a European construct, but also lent substance to claims about who had the authority to speak truthfully about it. So in mapping the world as this, for example, the science of geography began to do in earnest in the 19th century, the discipline was not engaging in a value-free scientific enterprise. It was producing the cartography that documented European power. And this power consisted in what Europeans could claim as their own, but also the value attached to anything making up the world. And that is what we are constantly doing when we deploy the vocabulary of the social sciences. The idea I'm trying to convey is that the ability to describe the world always rests on a prerogative to hold meaning hostage to a will to power by making it functional, in the case of Europe, to imperial designs. So you hold meaning hostage to a will to power by producing, for example, descriptions of Africa as rationalizations of Europe's civilizing mission. You make meaning functional to imperial designs by naturalizing the distinctions. So, for example, backward and advanced, underdeveloped and developed, north and south, etc., that gives substance to the idea of the world that you are helping to produce. Now, the world posited by those who came up with the idea of founding the League of Nations, a world the social sciences cheerfully subscribed to, was the world produced by imperialism, was the world produced by colonialism and by capitalism. So the intercourse it entered consisted of taking its effects for granted, and the connections it entailed prevented us from thinking out of the box, from integrating into our scholarly endeavors a concern with, imagining the possibility of other worlds. So once we committed ourselves to the inevitability of this world, we stifled innovation in our thinking. We became, as it were, like the proverbial fish in the aquarium, which wanders aloud, who, if God doesn't exist, changes the water. So our naming of the things making up the world is an account of the extent to which the commitment to the idea of the existence of a world that can be rendered intelligible is premised on the naturalization of the order of things, that is, on European dominance over the world. And perhaps in that sense, I could say, the League of Nations was an empirical statement producing the certainty required for us to believe in the existence of the world. And to the extent that it did so, it also erased all other possible worlds and cemented the belief in the existence of this one world. So the founding of the League of Nations was also a way of ordering the world, and the evolutionary bias underpinning the distribution of roles within the normative construct against the background of which the signatories of the League of the Covenant convinced themselves of the existence of the world, that enabled them to make the safe assumption that some countries had the duty to lead others, so Britain and France, in a world too complex for them to understand. So complex for Cameroon and Togo and Tanganyika to understand. So the idea that the complexity about which they spoke did not pertain exactly to the world, but rather to how the world had been constituted to be functional to the interests of the more advanced societies, never really crossed their mind. So the modern world that became such a daunting entity to people not yet able to find their bearings in it was the outcome of historical processes that converged towards celebrating the successful elimination of all other possible worlds. So simply stating as a matter of fact, the inability of these people to move, to find their way in this modern world, constituted them as people unable to fend off for themselves, while at the same time extolling the ways of world making that produced that condition of those people in Cameroon or in Togo. So mapping the world under these circumstances became potentially an act of complicity in lending legitimacy to how the world was made. And it's the same kind of complicity we engage in when we are not sufficiently critical in the way we deploy the vocabulary of the social sciences. For me, who's as a social scientist, because this is a world built on the slave trade, on colonial domination, on denying for far too long humanity to those not able to fend for themselves in the modern world, based on a humanist discourse that posited the basic equality of all people. So the idea of the existence of the world is one that needs to be challenged. And because of that, it is quite hard to let European languages off the hook. But the main culprit, of course, is the whole social science enterprise and its commitment to the idea of an intelligible world that can be retrieved scientifically. So I will wrap up and try to come to an end, and hopefully we can have a good discussion afterwards. Because this brings me actually back to the heart of my discussion, namely the question concerning how concepts manipulate our relationship to the world. I think that recognizing this is key to a useful conceptualization of the idea of Southern epistemologies. So Southern epistemologies should not be understood in geographical or even in cultural terms. Southern epistemologies, for me, are a way of acknowledging that manipulation yields knowledge, which is another way of saying that knowledge is somehow shorthand for sustaining the illusion that the world exists. I do not mean this in a, constructionist way. I mean it in the realist sense that our illusions of knowledge are real enough in their consequences. As Edward Said said, just as none of us is outside or beyond geography, none of us is completely free from the struggle over geography. In other words, it does not really matter whether we believe in the existence of the world. The fact that some of us do ensures that we are all affected by it. So is the problem with knowledge production then that we engage in it without considering everything that is worth considering? Or rather that the vocabulary we deploy sets the limits to what can be said and also to what can be challenged? What is left over when we remove all the objects we are familiar with from the stock of knowledge of the social sciences or the stock of knowledge that the social sciences produce? Is it merely concept theories and methods? Is it not time for us to begin to think about science not as the construction of objects, but rather as the reflection around how to construct objects. I think this is the urgent task of any theory of knowledge that hails from the South. Such an epistemology does not study the world tout court. Instead, it studies how to study the world. So a Southern epistemology concerns itself, in my view, with the construction of objects. The whole point of what we are doing here today, right now, is not to argue over the nature of objects, that is the world of Africa, of Latin America, or even, I don't know, social action, but rather to argue over how to argue about the things we argue about. In a sense, then, I guess what I'm seeing is that we need to discover the algorithms through which our conceptual vocabularies render the world in general, and Africa, in my case in particular, intelligible. And whether we like it or not, as scholars, we are heirs to the Enlightenment project. And this is not to say that we subscribe to the cultural, political, and economic agenda which the research program fostered by the Enlightenment project pervade. Yet, we are deeply implicated in it, which is why we are within, not outside. But equipped with the vital tool of translation, we can strategically deploy Southern epistemologies to deprive the dominant conceptual vocabularies of their innocence. Because knowledge, true knowledge, is what we get when the vocabularies we deploy to retrieve the world lose their innocence. I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Prof. Macamo, for a brilliant presentation. I now hand over to Prof. Makone.
Okay, thank you very much, dear colleague. Let me engage in a conversation with you. I want to get into the discussion via a very mundane question. In your intellectual apparatus, what is it that you understand by a conceptual vocabulary? What is the meaning of analytical concepts to you? Because you do refer quite a bit as you go through your presentation to issues about concept.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to understand for myself where notions of concepts fit in. And then after that, what was not clear to me was what is the nature of the relationship that you see between concepts and the world that is created by those through the deployment of those concepts and issues about political commitment. And then let me stop there to begin the conversation, then we can continue.
Thank you very much. I think the questions are good for two reasons. First of all, because they will help me to try and make my point even clearer. And secondly, because I think this is really the heart of the matter. So my starting point is the idea that we retrieve the world in a discursive manner. That is, we need descriptions of the world, and those descriptions of the world are made through the use of meaningful terms. So those meaningful terms are what we might also define as concepts. So especially for us who are social scientists, we have no other way of retrieving the world other than by deploying those concepts. Now, the problem with concepts is that they are not innocent, because concepts are always the outcome of how particular communities make sense of their world. So even when we appeal to the idea of objectivity, which I think we should always try to appeal to, the concepts that we will use to describe our world will also have their underpinning in a normative framework that reflects our culture, that reflects our way of life, and that reflects how we have experienced the world over time. And so when I speak about conceptual vocabularies, I'm speaking about the language which we need to use in order to speak about the world in an intelligible manner to other people. And in that respect, I wouldn't place too much emphasis, at least in the context of this presentation, to the notion of an analytical concept, because I would see that more in the restricted area of methodology. So an analytical concept as a concept which I can operationalize. That is a concept that I can define in a way that would enable me to carry out research. So that concept in this conversation is not as relevant to me. But what is relevant is really the idea that we need a language, and that language consists of concepts. So the idea of a conceptual vocabulary, and through that language, we try to make sense of the world, we render the world intelligible to us. And I think that's where all our problems begin, because most of us were trained, I was trained in the social sciences, and the social sciences have a very specific place of origin and a very specific time when they originated. And that's Europe. That's 18th century, 19th century Europe. So it is a language that was developed to describe a European world, right? So not a Shangaan world, like myself, not a Shona world. It was a European world, right? So often, I think the problem, the misgivings that we have as non-European scholars is to remove the European from those conceptual languages, and to try and replace them, perhaps with our own meanings, our own lived experience, our own representations of the world, or at least if we cannot do that, and that is where things may get a bit complicated. If we cannot do that, we try to find new ideas which we can use to articulate those concepts. So what we might call a theory. And so I would say, and that is why I insist on this idea of translation as theory from within, because I think, we are not living this conceptual world. We are still within that world, but maybe we are appealing to new ideas to use those concepts in ways that are more meaningful to us. Okay, that's the answer.
Let me deliberately misconstrue you for my own purposes.
Okay.
For you, then, concepts are not either true or false. Concepts are an intellectual mechanism for organizing the experiences which one encounters. Concepts, therefore, enable you to make visible or erase from view certain challenges. And the social sciences are a concept. Is that the case? That the social sciences constitute a concept which organizes the world in particular ways. And what we are faced with here is whether the way the social sciences organize the world is appropriate to a Shona scholar. Right? Somehow, I thought your argument was going to be the complete reverse. I thought your argument was that, let's say, a Shona Shangani epistemology is relevant to the Swiss social sciences. I thought you were arguing for the relevance of Southern epistemologies, not to the geographical South, but to the global North. In other words, that the global North scholarship is not, in some cases, relevant to the geographical South is obvious. What is interesting, though, is the insight, the extent to which scholarship in the global South illuminates problems which the geographical North is unable to tackle. That's where I thought you were going, right? That, in other words, the individuals who ultimately benefit most from a successful decolonial enterprise are the ones in global North, because they've got themselves caught up in an impasse, and they need insights from very different worlds to enable them to understand. Right. So from that perspective, let's say, if I can come to, let's say, Penn State and argue that African studies, therefore, let's say at Penn State, is not simply an interdisciplinary area. It's a way of thinking about problems in the United States, which they can't do without us.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. I fully agree with you. In fact, our intellectual agenda here in Basel, our motto is studying Africa, understanding the world.
Yes.
Right? Studying Africa, understanding the world. And the project Chanel mentioned when she introduced me, reversing the gaze.
Yes.
That is precisely our commitment. We take concepts that were either deployed in Africa. For example, in my case, I take the concept of retribalization, which was used by social anthropology in Southern Africa, mainly in Zambia, in South Africa. So expressing the fear of colonial administrators that Africans who were moving into towns were not becoming cosmopolitan. They were withdrawing into their tribal communities. So instead of being cosmopolitan, they were, becoming even more
retribalized. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So in this project, I take that concept and I use it to describe Swiss fears towards migration.
Yes.
That the Swiss are reacting exactly in the same way. So they are retribalizing. They are not becoming more cosmopolitan. And that is, of course, curious if you take into account the ethical proclamations Europeans always make about being, open, universal, liberal, and so on, progressive. And when you are confronted with a situation like this, you withdraw into your provincial you know, into your essential identity. So I think, you know, but let me come back to the main part of your question, because I think you are really helping me to not only to clarify these things to the audience, but also really to clarify these things to myself, right? So I think I have 3 basic points that I would like to make. So the first one is just a minor correction. So I am not saying that concepts organize. Yeah, concepts do not organize. Concepts describe. They are there for description. Yeah, but we use ideas to articulate concepts. And when we use ideas to articulate concepts, then the accounts we produce organize our perception of the world. So that is the basic sense in which I also understand the role of theory. Now, my second point is perhaps extended. I'll try to be brief. I am working on the idea that there is a moral, you know, that there is a moral ecology of concepts. And that this is something we have not sufficiently taken into account in our work. What I mean by that is that a concept entails always 3 dimensions. It entails a factual dimension, you know, so I can say the African Studies Center, there's an African Studies Center in, you know, at Penn State University. That's a fact, you know. So, you know, Penn State is just a statement of a fact, the existence of Penn State. But there is also a judgment, you know, and that judgment would be, you know, picking up what you said about what you are doing there. I would say, you know, the fact that you have the African Studies Center at Penn State University it means that you want to make America better in a certain sense. So that's a judgment, right? So it expresses an ethical commitment. And, you know, all concepts, even if we don't spell this out directly, even if we are not aware of it, they will always entail that. Yeah. So there is always that, a judgment. And perhaps the 3rd dimension might be something that, you know, we might want to call a recommendation, you know. So I could be saying, well, there's an African Studies Center at Penn State University, and that is good because it shows the commitment of the scholars there to contributing to a better United States. Every university should have an African Studies Center. That would be the recommendation, right? Now, it is there whether I say it or not. Now, it is through thinking through the implications of the moral ecology of concepts that we develop ideas that help us organize, as it were, the articulation of facts. So I'm sitting here and I am thinking about the concepts that I use as a social scientist. I have my experience as an African, you know, I have my particular relationship to the world as an African. And that is something that equips me to appreciate this moral ecology of concepts in particular ways. And when I think that through, I can bring that to bear on how I use concepts, right? And in so doing, I will be contributing. This is how I contribute. I can call it, this is how I use my Shangaan or Tsonga heritage to render concepts intelligible, right? And so that is for me, right? A Southern epistemology. That's what I mean by a Southern epistemology.
What you mean. Okay, right. I will then add 4 more dimensions to your understanding of concepts. I'll then say concepts appear, concepts subside, and concepts are replaced by others. I meant 3 instead of 4. Okay. In other words, concepts have an intellectual trajectory. They have a lifespan, right? And so in addition to what you have said, I would then add a lifespan orientation to concepts, appear, subside, and are replaced by others. Right. Anyway, let me stop. Chanel, there must be some other people with better ideas to talk about. We'll continue.
Okay.
Okay, currently there are no questions in the chat or any raised hands, but please feel free to ask a question if you want to and start with engagement.
Yeah,
I see Ashraf's,
Ashraf.
I see Ashraf's hand. It's raised. Go ahead, Ashraf.
Thank you so much for this presentation. And I need to ask about the same, we need to engage with the same point which Sinfri was also engaging with, the difference between concepts and ideas. I need first crudely to know how we differentiate between a concept and an idea. That's the first question. And the second question is that if you can hold the distinction between ideas and concepts in the way you're presenting them, I think we can talk now about traveling concepts as abstract entities without their organizing conceptual systems, or without organizing their ideological systems. So how do you react to this last point as well? Thank you.
Okay. No, I think that's a great question. So again, the distinction between concepts and ideas is the distinction between concepts and theories. I prefer to use the notion of ideas because I think it's much easier for when we use the word theory, things appear more complex than they actually are, right? So Chanel also mentioned a program I had with a friend and colleague from the University of Frankfurt in Germany, Mamadou Jawara. And in that program, we were helping young scholars, young university professors in West Africa, in Francophone West Africa, to acquire what we described as scholarly skills. Because unfortunately, in research funding in Africa, too much emphasis is placed on applied research instead of basic research. And so that's a distinction Mamadou Jawara and I make. So the difference between looking for solutions, so that's applied research, and identifying problems, that's basic research. So African researchers are reduced to the role of looking for solutions to problems other people framed. And so we want to change that. Now, in the process of thinking together with the scholars, with young scholars we were working, we came up, we started discussing really how we make sense of the world. how we deploy concepts, and realized that, concepts in themselves are nothing. They need a framework that activates their meanings. And that framework, consists of ideas. And so one exercise that we are finishing a book based on that. One exercise we engaged in was to ask every participant to think of a concept in their mother tongue, right? To think of a concept in their mother tongue, to think of a concept in their discipline. So sociology, psychology, history, anthropology, geography, and so on. And then try to translate that concept into their mother tongue, right? And then think about the difficulty of doing that. And often the difficulty does not come from the fact that, there may not be a word in that language that would translate that. The difficulty comes from not being able to find the idea which will articulate that word, right? And so we also ask them to think about, they could take proverbs from their language. Think of proverbs in your language and try to articulate some of these proverbs with the theories in your discipline, because that's what proverbs do. Proverbs help us make sense of the world. Proverbs help us give meaning to concepts. So that's the distinction I'm trying to make, Ashraf. The distinction between concepts simply as tools that we use. These are discursive tools that we use, right? And the ideas which we need to make these concepts operational in some way. Now, the idea of traveling concepts is one that is, of course, interesting. It's been in discussion for some time now. So, I think that the issue that some of the scholars who engage in this discussion raise is that there are certain concepts we assume to have universal validity, neglecting the fact that it's not the concepts that have universal validity, but it is the ideas underlying them, the ideas that activate these concepts. So if concepts travel, that is because we have accepted the theories that carry them, the ideas that carry them. So it's not the concepts we have to challenge, but it is the ideas underlying them, right? And that is why it's we can, for example, I mean, if you look at every critical position that has been expressed from the global South, what you will find is that most of these people are questioning the ideas that are the carriers of concepts. Take Dipesh Chakrabarty's idea of provincializing Europe. What he is saying there is that we should not take the concepts of historiography, for example, just in this case, the concepts of historiography for granted. We have to question the account of history that underlies the use of concepts to write history. And then you will see that there are people who are basically confusing their local experience for for a universal experience. It's ideas at stake here, not concepts, because concepts are just there. We can make them mean everything that we want them to mean. That's the problem. So I hope that that helps to clarify.
Just as a follow-up point, thank you so much. You clarified the distinction for me in a nice way. But if we take Simfy's point about the trajectory or the life span of a concept, so if you say to someone, for example, here in the Arab world or wherever, for example, like democracy or even you can say secularism, these are concepts, but these concepts again they have some traces of the trajectory within which they were formulated. You see the point? So we need to pay attention to trajectory. It's not just and the second thing is that now which I get from you is that the problem is not about the mobility of the concepts, it's about the mobility of the frameworks. So I think this point is really significant because concepts like native speakerhood, which is really problematic within the Northern theory, can be somehow reformulated from other Southern frameworks. Thank you so much. Thanks. Thanks.
No, thank you, Ashraf. Let me just respond to you because what you're saying is very, very important. Also to my argument. Of course, concepts like secularism, concepts like democracy. The reason why they are so difficult to deal with in certain parts of the world is not because our ways of life would be incompatible with, if you like, the ethical goods that those concepts are supposed to be protecting, right? That's not the key, the issue. The issue we have with those concepts is the framework that gives them particular meanings when they are used, to talk about us, right? So, for example, in my own country, you hear people who would say things like, well, democracy is not for us. Democracy is a Western notion. We have our own democracy. And I say to them, look, I think you are approaching this issue the wrong way around. You're worrying too much about a concept. Think this way. What do you value in a political community? Do you value the right that people have to speak their mind? Do you value the right that people have for fair trial? Do you value for pluralism of pluralism of ideas and so on and so on? That's the way you want to think about this, right? And if you say to yourself, yes, I do, right? Then ask yourself the next question: what kinds of political arrangements would protect those things? So forget democracy. Forget the word democracy. Just think in practical terms, right? And then you will frame your own notion of democracy. I mean, no democracies are alike. I mean, Switzerland, they're voting every day. They've got referendum every day. And that's not what the French are doing. That's not what the Germans are doing. That's not what the Americans are doing. Yeah. But we recognize, something there, so a bit like what Michael Walzer was saying, when he talked about thick and thin, right? Concepts acquire this thick meaning locally, not on a world scale. And that's what we should, I don't know. So, I mean, thank you. I just needed to say something to that because I think it's very, very important. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Arthur? You are muted, Arthur.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I think the term translation includes a world within it, and it provokes many, many, many discussions. I'm going to start with an experience that I had and go on from there, and as always, I'll try to be as brief as possible. I remember back when I worked as an interpreter, and this was in the 60s and 70s primarily. I worked with African leaders. That was part of the name of the program, and Latin American leaders. And I would take them around the country to meet important people and translate for them. But we were together basically 24 hours. So after dinner, we would often sit around having discussions. And one of the things that impressed me about them was that most of them had already a standing theory of decoloniality that they could express eloquently. For me, it was almost a shock because it was so contrary to anything that I had read or studied in my studies. But they understood perfectly. In other words, they had translated their education, most were Francophone, in Belgium or in France, and they were totally attuned to what we would call the reality, the North-South reality, the post-colonial reality. So what I'm saying is, in talking about translation, let's not forget how language, culture, and society actually work. Sometimes we can lose track of that when we're at our desk in our universities and we have to finish an article or a book or so on and so forth. Think about language, and I'll give you another example. We have something called English. There are so many Englishes that we can't count them. There's something that we have labeled African-American English, which was spoken by African-Americans historically and in the present in the United States. And it has its own qualities. But some of the qualities that are never discussed in the literature produced in so-called Western context is that fundamentally, every language has, or every form of a language has enough in common with other forms of the language so that we can talk and we assume we understand each other. So African Americans could talk to whites and get things done because we could understand each other. But what was not known is that in African American English, there are what? Old sayings, there are discourses, and using the term discourses, I'm talking about what's spoken. There are also text, what is written, that has full theories of decoloniality, which do not get out of the community to travel in certain places. So there was constant critique. Not only that, African American English, it's a form of English, has developed its own grammar. It's at the level of grammar, not just at the level of terms, to critique. And that critique is basically talking about decoloniality, which is what we're doing. And just to give you an example, there's a structure we use, and Harry Truman was president when I was growing up. And I remember somebody saying something along the lines of, well, Truman said such and such with his white Confederate ass. And that's what we call an ass construction, believe it or not. And African-American discourse is full of them. So what they were doing is saying, Truman said X, but let me give you the essentials for translating what he said. And that's a structure that's everywhere in African-American conversations and discourses and so on and so forth. So what I want to say is, it seems in the final analysis that translation is a trait of the human mind, and that it has been going on since the beginning of humanity. We do it automatically. Okay. Now, what you're saying is something very, very valuable, but I want to frame it in a way that you may not agree with. What we're doing at Penn State and in Mali and in various other places is we are professionalizing decolonial studies and decolonial thinking. It's our job. We're in a situation where we can make it part of our job and work on it consistently in a scheduled way, thinking about certain products we are going to produce in the future. But the African students, as I said, had a full-blown decolonial theory, but it wasn't projected outside their own group. They had a full understanding. They had done their translating. I want to say, going back to the notion of power, and I'll make this my last point, is translation is intimately connected to power. So you can translate, but do you have the power to be heard in certain environments? You can translate, but do you have the power to do something about your translation and the understanding that it provides? And of course, in many ways, we in the academy are in a situation where we translate, and I think we do it very well. But where's the power? Do we have any? Are we going to be able to operationalize any of our concepts and ideas? So those are some thoughts I wanted to put on the table.
Thank you so much. They're very rich thoughts. And I have to say to you, I'm so glad to be speaking to you, because I was also trained as a translator and interpreter. So I worked as an interpreter for the government of Mozambique. Even interpreted for Samora Machel. And I I worked as a conference interpreter. So I'm very sensitive to what you were saying. And and that's what I like about the notion of translation, because it makes us aware precisely of the different worlds from which we're speaking, and it cautions us against taking things for granted. That's the one thing we shouldn't do. We shouldn't take things for granted. But the only way we can do that is by engaging in conversations, by challenging one another. And here, maybe I can share with you part of my intellectual debt concerning, everything that has to do with translation. So the late Ghanaian philosopher, Kwasi Wiredu, he introduced into his philosophy the notion of untranslatability. So when discussing the challenge of using European philosophical concepts to make sense of African world. So the question he asked was whether these are, can render this world really intelligible, given that the assumptions underlying those concepts are different, and maybe they are not even intelligible to Ghanaians, right? And he also realized that if he took that to the last consequences, he would have to conclude that it's impossible to translate from one language to another. But he said, actually, the basic principle of translation is to become aware of the limits of your understanding. So long as you think you understand, you are not ready to translate, because you are probably moving in your own world. So you need that radical challenge to your understanding, but you also need the intellectual honesty to acknowledge that you don't understand. So I like this. Of course, I do not take it to the same extremes as he did, because, so some people might read him to be saying that there is a basic incommensurability, among concepts from different languages. But actually, the incommensurability is in the way that concepts are used. So the ideas which are deployed to articulate those concepts, right? So if we can spell those ideas out, we will not be able to produce good translations of concepts, but we will be able to understand what we don't understand, to realize what we don't understand. And I think that's the key idea. I think it's an idea which you find, in some of those people who say we have to unlearn, unlearning, right? So that's the challenge for me. That's the challenge that the idea of Southern epistemologies places before us. It's always ideas, your excellent example about African American English, of course, it's not the words that are a problem. It's the ideas that activate those words, So it's the African American experience of being a person or of not being a person in this historical geographical space, that lends certain meanings to the concepts, right? And so actually, American society, the general American society, will profit a lot from listening to the meanings that are being produced by the use of the English language by African Americans, because that will expand their horizons. So I really like everything that you were saying, and of course, power is there. It's always there. It's and we have to be aware. So when people are saying, "Can the subaltern speak?" Well, the subaltern can speak, of course, but can the subaltern be heard? That's the question. Can the subaltern be heard? And what are the conditions that have to be created for the subaltern to be heard? Right? Translation. That's my point. Translation. It's really about freeing some people from their small worlds. People live in very small worlds under the illusion that they live in a big world, right? So we need to free them from that illusion, and they will be better human beings, perhaps. or even better human beings.
Mhm.
So sorry for being so inarticulate, but I really appreciate what you were saying. It's right, to the heart of the matter.
I wanted to say something very quickly, and thank you for your response. I want to say something very quickly about incommensurability. I'm a linguist, and we deal with it every day. Just to give you an example, when we're working with Native American languages, which of course have a very different historical cultural history, and we are dealing with these words and constructions that we have to attach meanings to, and we can't do it unless we delve into the culture.
Yeah.
And that allows us to get closer and closer and figure out ways to reduce incommensurability as we go along. It's a project. And most of the time, we find the English word that best fits and that we move along because we have to get out articles, we have to get out books, but we know it's a lifetime process. For example, the Navajo word hozon, and I guess I'm pronouncing it pretty well. It's often presented as a word that refers to everything that is good, beautiful, harmonious, all of these things. It what destroys our minds trying to think in our situation of a word or to deal with a word that refers to everything that is good, that produces harmony on earth. Okay. But it's a word that's commonly used, but we have to dig into the culture to get to it. The other thing I was going to say, if I haven't forgotten it, is, I'll say something very quickly about the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which everybody's familiar with. And the current state of the research is that language does not determine what we think. It influences it to varying extents, sometimes hardly at all, sometimes a bit more. And it's a good thing to keep in mind when we're thinking about all these things we're worried about. Democracy, I have to say something about democracy. Which I haven't seen any of lately. Consider the United States, which is, and this is almost the beginning classic exercise in a class on decolonial thinking. This thing that goes on here that is called a democracy, where you have these elections with legal bribery and all sorts of plutocratic structures involved, and so many classes of people excluded from the franchise. Can you actually call it a democracy at the end of the day? Even though you can use these levers of our democratic government, say, to get your streets paved after taking on a second job to get it done. But there are basic things in our lives every day confronting us. We just had election day the other day. And we have to take those and tear those apart. It's not just the now north-south thing, but it's other things that are tangential that ultimately are part of the now north-south divide that we're talking about. Anyway, I'd love to give a sermon, but I'll stop.
Maybe just thanks. On that.
Okay, sure, you can go ahead.
On that last point, even though we are not at the stage where we can speak freely, there's something I would like to say about that. For a long time, I was puzzled by the realization that a country that described itself as democratic could have lived for so long with slavery. You know, so, and I was asking myself, how is that possible? Until I realized that the question was a different one, or the answer was a different one. And that was that democracy made that possible. Democracy understood as the rule of the majority, right? So there was no incompatibility there. But you see, even in saying that, I am activating certain ideas, right? And those ideas help me make sense of the word. And here I use that purposely. I say the word, the term, and not the concept, but the word democracy, precisely to use it in its thinnest possible form, right? So with no assumptions attached to it, because I think that's also the thing with words. The more assumptions words carry, the more they move towards being concepts, right? Because, you know, what makes a concept is basically the assumptions underlying the use of a word. And so, I mean, and that is what gives us the possibility also of challenging the uses of certain concepts. So anyone would be right to question the use of the word democracy or the concept of democracy to describe the American political system. You know, so long as you spell out the ideas which you draw from to challenge the use of that particular concept. So I'm very happy that that we are, you know, we are finding more and more confirmation for the importance of perhaps paying more attention to this tension and distinction between concepts and ideas, because I think that is what is at stake.
Thank you so much, Prof. Macamo. We have a few questions still left, but I think we'll end the session here and then take the rest of the questions in the after party so that we can speak more freely in your